Hello there, it's Andrea again. I just wanted to discuss Bora Chung's piece, The Embodiment, because it's really pertinent to a lot of concepts related to social injustice that women experience in the healthcare field. So I'm going to relate this to some of my own personal experience as a mother and as someone who has given birth and been part of the system, and also as a healthcare worker. I'm a respiratory therapist in the neonatal ICU, so I work with a lot of women who were pregnant or postpartum, who have babies in the NICU, who have many of whom have healthy babies that they're going to bring home. Some are going to experience fetal loss, or rather have experienced fetal loss. Some experience infant loss. And there are many who have children who go home with lasting disabilities. So we kind of see some of these concepts in Bora Chung's writing. So while we talk about Bora Chung and her writing of the embodiment, I'm just going to be making some coleslaw here. I just kind of eyeball it and put the appropriate portions in there as I see fit to color it how I want it and to just season to taste. So the first thing I do, I just cut up the veggies and salt them so that some of that liquid can start coming out. So basically in the embodiment, we start with this young woman who is our protagonist, who's having this prolonged menstruation. Now, she's been in to a gynecologist's office before, and she doesn't want to go back because women are kind of made to feel like they did something wrong somehow by going to see a gynecologist. Essentially, she puts it off as long as she can, and then she starts having some dizziness, at which point she realizes that it's inevitable. She's going to have to see somebody about this. So I should mention first that Bora Chung is from South Korea, and in the South Korean culture, it's really kind of forbidden to even discuss menstruation. So that's another thing that I just kind of love about this piece, because it's so natural to our bodies to menstruate. And even in our culture, I feel like it can be really uncomfortable for women to talk about their bodies and reproductive health, to where it does impact their ability to discuss with their gynecologist issues that they might be having. So here we have our first quote. It was almost 2 weeks without any sign of stopping. The flow seemed to taper off at night, but would inevitably return by dawn. A fortnight later, the blood still flowed. Should she see a gynecologist? But the gynecologist's office was a place a young unmarried woman could not visit without feeling oddly guilty. So once she was dizzy, there was like no other option. And they just kind of sat her down and started doing an ultrasound without really discussing any of her, like what they would be doing in the procedure. So here we have, she wiped off the gel as best she could. It kept getting all over her hands and clothes, no matter how vigorously she mopped. And she went back to the consultation room. The doctor glanced at the chart before him. Have you been stressed lately or had any big changes in your environment? I'm writing my master's thesis, but I don't think I'm stressed about it. The doctor gave her a look before scribbling something down. Stress causes hormonal imbalance that can lead to your situation. According to the ultrasound, you're fine, so I'll prescribe you some birth control pills. Take them for a week, go off of them for one, and take them for 3 more weeks, then rest for a week, and so on. You'll be back to normal in 2 to 3 months. So essentially, she relayed to him that she's not stressed, and he dismissed it. He had already decided that she was stressed before she responded, and this is kind of indicative of how the healthcare field can be sometimes. So from my firsthand experience and from stories that I hear from people who have been in the field longer than me, essentially the outgoing culture is one where the men are doctors, the women in healthcare are nurses, and the doctor's word was kind of like God's, and you would just adhere to it and do whatever the doctor said. Now, over the last 40 or 50 years, we have many other disciplines within the healthcare field, one of which being respiratory. And formerly, respiratory was done by nursing, and then management of the ventilators, that aspect of it, was done by the doctors. So now doctors are getting more input from different disciplines. They're putting in more consults, and the former way is kind of going out where, doctors are more open and doctors collaborate with the patients more. That being said, while that may be an improvement, we also have more of like a consumer-based culture, which is sometimes difficult because the doctors try to work with the patients to give them what they want. However, they may not always have the education to understand their healthcare needs or to be able to make an informed decision. So now we kind of have this duality in this transition. But it looks like the protagonist in this story is experiencing some remnants of the older culture where the doctor just kind of tells you what to do and just you're supposed to heed their word and just kind of go along with what they say, even if the symptoms that you're experiencing aren't in line with what they're saying you're experiencing. And of course, he's dismissing her as being emotional, as being stressed out, which is a common assessment of women, despite the fact that they may not endorse those feelings. So essentially, we go on, she takes these pills, but the bleeding doesn't subside whenever she tries to come off within 2 or 3 months. So she ends up going back on the pills, not wanting to get dizzy and sick again, but she ends up taking more pills to try to manage this. Mind you, the doctor said this would go away in 2 to 3 months. It did not. He was incorrect. And she didn't want to have to see a gynecologist, again, after the way he made her feel. Very relatable feeling. And all while she ends up footing the bill for this, for what ends up being 6 months. So she's also paying the price, both physically and with this tax on her body. Okay, so she felt unwell again and had to go to the hospital. And then here was our next quote. At a big hospital, she got x-ray scans taken and her blood pressure and urine were examined. The doctor informed her and her results in an emotionless manner. You're pregnant. Excuse me? You should see an obstetrician. She went down a few floors to see the hospital's obstetrician, a young woman in her 30s who wore an unbelievable amount of makeup. After a few more fairly unpleasant examinations, the obstetrician declared her diagnosis in an ice-cold voice. You're 6 weeks pregnant, but I'm unmarried and have no boyfriend. Okay, so we're seeing a difference here in the diegesis where you can get pregnant without having sex. So I don't know if maybe in that culture, if it's just more shameful to is it more shameful to be pregnant from mismanaging your period than to have unmarital sex, I guess. All right, so I have some green cabbage here, and I'm going to be working on my purple now. Okay, on with the quote. You've never had any sexual experiences or taken any pills? I did take some birth control pills for a while because my period wouldn't stop. For how long? 6 months. The doctor gave her a sharp look, narrowing her bright blue eyeshadow, thickly penciled eyes. Were they prescribed? The doctor told me to take them for a couple months. And you don't really need a prescription for birth control pills. Her voice trailed off as she felt oddly ashamed. If the doctor told you to take them for just 2 to 3 months, you should have taken them for just 2 to 3 months. Well, my period just wouldn't stop. The doctor sighed, her irritation out of her vividly painted lips. If your body happens to be abnormal, a side effect from taking birth control pills for a very long time can be pregnancy. Really? But aren't birth control pills supposed to prevent pregnancy? Her objection came out meek. The doctor's black and blue gaze immediately turned sharp again. You're the one who overdid it with the pills. It's your own fault. Medicine isn't candy that you can gorge on whenever you feel like it. What do I do now? The doctor flipped through the chart. Does the child have a father? Excuse me? Does the child have someone who can be their father? No. The doctor looked up and again gave her a scary look through the thick makeup. Then you better hurry up and find a man who's willing to be the father. This is very much like real life to me. I know, like, she really wasn't, like, given an option, like, of even adoption or abortion. It's just like, you have to find a father for this child. And here we see that she was able to get pregnant through these birth control pills, to where obviously in real life that wouldn't be able to happen. And she doesn't endorse that she had any sexual experiences. And I think it's interesting because although this is made to seem like it was entirely her fault, that there wasn't even another party who impregnated her, the reality is she's in the circumstances from her poor medical information that she was given by her doctor. It is actually entirely the doctor's fault, or involuntary, because she can't control her periods. It's like none of us can control our menstruation. If anything, it's not something that a man could even relate to, outside of the experience of being incontinent, you know? So she's in a very vulnerable situation. I know, at least for me, whenever I had my first pregnancy, this was like 12 plus years ago, so maybe things are different now. I didn't have any health insurance. So there was a big health insurance crisis. You were only able to stay on your parents' insurance until you were 19. And a lot of people who didn't have an education or were in school didn't have any health care. So at the time, I did what was suggested by a coworker, and that was to apply for welfare insurance because they would allow you to qualify for being pregnant. So whenever I called the welfare office, I was instructed to go to this, I think it was called like New Life Planning place, because they couldn't just use your at-home pregnancy test. They needed to have you go somewhere to verify that you were pregnant, where you would go and physically take a test right there in front of somebody. So I went down to this place, took the pregnancy test, and came back positive. And this woman who interpreted the test let me know I was pregnant. And at that time, like, it wasn't planned. So this was like a scary situation for me. And I was scared to be a mom, naturally. Because as a mom, I think you're expected to be perfect, which is something that no one can achieve. And it's a sharp change in priorities. You were the center of your world. You were doing things that were best for you. Now suddenly you have someone else that you have to prioritize, and you're supposed to prioritize over yourself. And you can't be a good parent, basically, no matter what you do, in somebody's eyes at least. So I was scared. And whenever we talked about it, this woman was like, "You're not thinking about having an abortion, are you?" And I was like, "No." And obviously I don't regret not having an abortion. I love my son. But they said, well, we can provide you counseling. We can provide you with resources for adoption if you don't want to keep this child, you know. So it was interesting because I went through this legitimate means through the government to try to get health insurance and basically receive this anti-abortion, I don't necessarily want to say propaganda, but okay, so I got my carrots in there and now I have my green onions. I'm just going to cut these tops off and I'm going to try to just save as much as the green as I can without it looking like weird or gross. So basically, another aspect of this was that she didn't have any solidarity with this female obstetrician, which would have been nice. But I think sometimes in the medical field, you'll see that female doctors can be even more abrasive because to succeed within that culture that is still prevalent in some areas, they need to be like more cutthroat, more insistent on their own opinions, and essentially they don't want to admit fault, maybe due to legal concerns, but they're just like, they just band-aided her issue by like just prescribing her medication to get her out the door. And now here she is. She's pregnant. She's the one who has to deal with these repercussions. It's not them. And they're just kind of blaming her, not adhering to the medical advice. So then the theme for the rest of the story largely just becomes centered around her finding a father for this baby. And she goes on a lot of interesting Seon dates. So a Seon date in Asian culture is kind of like the way that a woman may pursue like finding like an arranged marriage. So basically, she goes on these series of dates. Now the first guy, he was like actually a little bit understanding. Now mind you, this is early in her pregnancy, and once she met on this date, she was like, she became nauseous and queasy, and this man was like understanding of her situation. And she asked him if he would be the father of her baby. And he said he just needed a little bit more time to think about it. Like, this was a big decision. He doesn't know her. And she kind of moves on. So the other Seon dates aren't quite as understanding of her and her situation. And eventually it gets so bad that like her family sees that there's no success. And I know a lot of times in Asian culture, and I'm not sure if this is true specifically in South Korea, but they don't want her to like they want to marry the girls off, because otherwise being unmarried and remaining unmarried can bring shame on your family. So they end up actually putting an ad in the paper so that to try to help her find a father. She gets a lot of calls. Some are like jokes, some are more serious, some are really like desperate. And she gets this one call from this 33-year-old who asks, hey, is age a concern? And she's like, no. And actually asked her, like, what are you looking for in a father of the baby? And he seemed like a really nice guy. She's really considering this one. She goes on the date, come to find he was actually trying to get the date on behalf of his stepfather. So, I'm sorry, his wife's father. So she ends up sitting there. She's at this date with this older man, and he's basically like just looking for an heir because this guy's not, he doesn't want this man who arranged this date to be his heir and to get his inheritance. So he says he has a lot of money. He could like set her up for life. And he just basically has to go home with her and like conceive this child, or like give her his seed so that this baby will develop properly. Meanwhile, one of the jokesters who had called her in response to the newspaper ad shows up at this place, and he was threatening that he was going to broadcast that he actually was the child's father, and this child is a bastard. So he now gets into it with this rich man and says, I am going to put this out there and basically like ruin her reputation, ruin this child's reputation if you don't give me set amount of money. So now this old man's entourage gets into a brawl with this man. And fortunately for our protagonist, she's kind of able to retreat, and she makes it out of the restaurant and gets on a bus. Now, on this bus, this woman feels bad for her because at this point, she's like 5 or 6 months pregnant, and she offers her up her seat. She takes the seat, and then she realizes, oh, you're the woman from the newspaper ad. So it seems like our protagonist just can't get any escape from this. Okay, so I'm just putting like a liberal amount of salt on my veggies here, and I'm just going to kind of mix them up by hand. You know, obviously, make sure your hands are clean and things. So here we have this quote from this woman on the bus. I mean, that's life, the older woman went on to say. She's like pitying her. And life goes on. Think of the child in your belly. Live only for the child. It's not easy raising a kid alone these days. But you've got to be strong and keep living your life. Children grow up so fast. Mark my words, today will seem like a distant memory soon enough. Later at home, she took comfort in this unwanted advice, like I said, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she was ravenous. She wanted to eat something delicious for the baby. She jumped up from her seat. When she opened her eyes again, she was lying on the floor. Why am I lying here? She managed to sit up. It took some time for her to gather her wits. The anemia. And I must have fainted when I got up. She felt around the back of her head. There was a large bump. It began to scare her. She felt a warmth between her legs. So the fetus was finally moving again by the time she called 911 and got to the ambulance. And she's just like on the way to the hospital. She has this pounding headache and she was bleeding from this gash in her head. She goes ahead and starts begging this paramedic to be the father of her baby. And then she realizes that the driver of this ambulance is actually her first see-on date. So then she begins to beg him to be the father of her baby. They're basically ignoring her and just trying to stabilize her. She gets to the hospital. She has this pounding headache and finally an urge to push. So after she pushes out this baby, she has some relief. Despite the pounding headache that wasn't addressed by the medical staff. Here, we'll take a pause. So by the way, I'm making this coleslaw because I'm going to be making some fish tacos. I have some fish here. I'm seasoning with some Old Bay, garlic, onions, a little bit of cilantro, and I just kind of made this seasoning blend. And then I also have some lemon here that I'm just going to squeeze on it whenever I'm finished coating it. So I thought that the coleslaw might be a good choice because we have these carrots in it, and carrots are traditionally considered to be like a phallic symbol. And we're going to mix this naturally with the mayonnaise, and mayonnaise contains eggs. So here we have, similar to Bora Chung's embodiment, where we have this egg that needs fertilized. She's looking for a father for this. So I thought that this might go together well. But yeah, typically I just choose what I'm going to eat based on what I'm hungry for. So this is an exception. But yeah, and then I just kind of eyeballed the veggie mix that I have there. And I just want a little bit more orange. So I decided that I'm going to grind up another carrot. And yeah, I'm going to try to get this done and put down my baby. Is it good? Is it going to be good? Oh, taste tester. She's ready. Okay, and we'll get back. Okay, guys, so I looked up a little bit more about the South Korean culture surrounding pregnancy, and I found this concept called taegyo. So it's spelled Taegyo. This is a set of practices that are said to foster prenatal development in the fetus, and it's rooted in the idea that the mother's physical and emotional well-being are what causes the fetus to develop. So I thought that really added to this in an interesting way. And I basically, the fetus, the baby actually, what she gave birth to, ends up being this crystalline blood clot. And at first she wasn't sure why it wasn't crying, but then whenever she saw this blood clot, she didn't really understand what happened. So here we have her asking in the delivery room. I said, "What is this?" "It's a baby," snapped the obstetrician. Her face was half covered in a surgical mask, but her bright blue eyeshadow and pitch black eyeliner were unmistakable. So she goes on to scold her. This is what happens if you can't find a father for your baby. And she continues to speak the same rhetoric, this is your fault, this isn't our fault. And now she's examining the blood clot further. "The baby is looking for its mother," the nurse said softly, "the one who handed her the baby. Now it's looking at the mother. Look back into its eyes." She could feel the blood clot looking at her, as well, but she couldn't tell exactly where the eyes were, or frankly, where its head was and where its body began. Confused, she turned the blood clot about, examining it. The baby kept squirming and suddenly began to shudder. The black-red clot very briefly shone transparent and crystalline, like a blood-colored jewel. The next moment, the baby disintegrated into a pool of liquid blood. Her hands and chest soaked in the blood, and her arms still curved from when she had held the baby. She started to mute. She stared down mutely at the ruined front of her gown and the puddle of blood in the middle of her gown, in the middle of the delivery table. So I thought that it was really interesting how it says that her hands were still curved and in place of the way she was holding the baby. And to me, it just reminded me of like unexpected feelings that women sometimes have when they have a baby, or unfulfilled expectations as to what the birthing process would be like even, or how their baby would end up. So when we say that a woman is expecting a baby, it's that you expect that to turn into a baby, a healthy baby, but that's not always the case. And whenever it isn't the case, women tend to blame themselves. Women blame themselves for needing a cesarean. They'll say they didn't work hard enough. They mismanaged their labor. And women who go to childbirth classes, I should say, are taught to have a birthing plan. So this is when a lot of women form their expectations. So they might say, oh, I'm going to have a natural birth. I'm not going to have any medication. I'm not going to have a cesarean. And a lot of times these are totally out of their control, what's going to end up needing to happen for that baby. As well as if they go into preterm labor, that's something that's not going to be in their birth plan. And women blame themselves for it. And this is something we see time and time again in the NICU. And it's not something that I think the healthcare system is prepared to address. Now, postpartum depression, for instance, is something that is largely neglected. Postpartum psychosis is rarely recognized, which is all related to a hormonal imbalance. So our protagonist doesn't know how to feel in this. She's partially relieved that she passed this clot. She's partially disappointed that she's not going to have a baby now after all that. And we don't see that she's blaming herself, but we see this obstetrician continues to blame her. And I'm wondering if part of that, this obstetrician's role is supposed to be like this woman's inside voice. I'm just wondering, let me know what you guys think in the comments. But I have this coleslaw. This coleslaw is done. If you want your coleslaw to be like super smooth, you could always use mandolin. I don't do that because I like my skin and I'll cut my fingers off with it. Okay, so 2 things I forgot to add to my coleslaw that were apparent upon tasting it was celery seed. And then I also want to add like a liberal amount of pepper. So one other thing I wanted to mention was just how my experience was different, even between both of my children. Like my first child, like I felt so much love for him immediately. But my second child, after I had her, like I looked at her like I knew I was responsible for her. But I just didn't feel the same feeling of just like overwhelming love. Like that took some time. It took days. And after sharing my experience with other women, I found that this actually is not terribly uncommon. This is just something that they don't prepare you for, through your OBGYN. And then women who have children who have disabilities, they tend to blame themselves. Even my child has a genetic condition, and I found myself blaming myself for it. It's because time for a taste test. Is it good? Who's that? Say bye. How is it?